It started with whispers in the small, wind-brushed town of Windhill, where nothing unusual ever really happened except for the slow ticking of days and the changing of seasons that colored the hills with gold and gray, until the day the girl was buried and a scruffy, unclaimed stray dog sat motionless beside her coffin, his eyes fixed not on the mourners or the pastor or the sobbing parents, but on the casket itself, as if he could see something no one else could. He wasn't from the neighborhood, not known to any of the townsfolk gathered under the weeping sky in the chapel yard. His fur was matted, his ribs faintly outlined beneath a coat that had long since lost its luster. And yet, in that moment, he looked like he belonged more than anyone else, like his soul had been tethered to the girl's in some quiet corner of the world long before today. The townspeople watched in stunned silence, some frowning, some whispering, but none dared move him as he curled up beside the pale white coffin like a soldier on final watch. The girl's name was Clara Densmore, age 10, lost in a tragic accident just days before, when a faulty railing gave way, and she tumbled into the rocky creek behind her school, an event that broke the town's spirit like a snapped twig. Her parents, Edith and Harold, devastated and hollow-eyed, barely noticed the dog at first. But when the pastor paused his final prayer to acknowledge the loyalty of all God's creatures, murmurs rose again. What no one knew was that Clara had been sneaking food to a stray dog behind the old train yard for nearly 3 months. A secret she had whispered only to her diary and her little brother, Eli, who now clung to his mother's dress and pointed toward the dog with wide, tear-filled eyes, whispering, "That's him, Mama. That's the dog Clara called Shadow." The name landed like a stone in the water, rippling outward into the memories of those present, drawing connections no one had made before the mysterious food scraps Clara always asked to pack, the muddy footprints outside her window, the times she smiled quietly to herself after school. And then it began. Shadow did not leave after the burial. For days, he remained at the cemetery, resting beside the grave even in the rain, refusing food from anyone but Eli, who began visiting him each evening, whispering stories and reading from Clara's diary, which he had tucked beneath his sweater like a sacred treasure. And the strangest thing began to unfold each time Eli read a passage aloud. Shadow would lift his head and react in subtle ways, sometimes whining, sometimes wagging his tail, sometimes laying his head on the dirt as though remembering. The townsfolk were moved. They brought food, blankets, even built a small shelter over the grave where Shadow slept. Reporters came and went, calling it the loyal dog of Windhill, and the story spread like wildfire across social media, news stations, and talk shows, drawing hundreds to visit the grave, many of whom left flowers and letters. But then, something happened that turned the emotional tale into a haunting mystery. Eli, while reading one night beside the grave, came upon an unfinished entry in Clara's diary, one dated very day she died. It read, "If anything happens to me, I hope Shadow remembers the spot in the woods where we found the key." It might be nothing, but it felt special, like it was waiting for us. That night, guided by Shadow's sudden alertness and excited barks, Eli and his father followed the dog through the foggy woods behind the cemetery, deeper than any trail usually went, to a place where a tree's roots formed a natural hollow. Shadow began to dig furiously, whimpering as if in panic, until his paws struck something metallic. It was an old tin box, rusted but still intact. Inside were photographs, grainy black and white images of a little girl who looked hauntingly like Clara, and a letter dated 1923, written by another girl named Eleanor, who wrote of dreams, of hearing voices, of meeting a dog with shadowy eyes that guided her to safety during a fire no one else remembered. The town's historical society confirmed the letter's authenticity, and the story that unfolded was almost too strange to believe. A legend about a guardian spirit in the form of a dog, one who appeared to lost or special children and led them to places they were meant to find. Clara had found the same spot, the same key, perhaps even the same dog, nearly a century later. Shadow became more than a loyal pet. He became a symbol, a mystery, a miracle. Eventually, Clara's parents adopted him, and he slept at the foot of Eli's bed every night, sometimes waking and looking toward the window as though waiting. But the real twist came months later when Eli, now more curious than ever, began researching the tree where they found the box and discovered a missing persons report from 1902 about a young girl who vanished in that very area. The dog, the key, the box, each linked across time by stories and scars and unspoken magic. Shadow lived for 3 more years, never straying far from Clara's grave or Eli's side, and when he passed, the entire town mourned him like a fallen hero. But even in death, the story didn't end. Weeks after Shadow's burial beside Clara, townsfolk began to report sightings of a black silhouette near the cemetery at night, a figure that resembled a dog, always sitting, always watching. Skeptics called it imagination, but those who knew, who felt the chill and the calm all at once, believed Shadow still kept watch, not just over Clara's grave, but over every child who wandered too far, every soul on the edge of being forgotten. And in Windale, where the seasons still changed slowly, and the stories traveled gently from porch to porch, Shadow became legend, a guardian in the mist, born of love, loyalty, and the kind of magic only dogs and children seemed to truly understand. Shadow's grave was small and unassuming, marked with a smooth, river-worn stone that Eli had picked himself and carved into with shaking hands, just the word Shadow and the date etched beneath. But people came from miles away to leave flowers, dog treats, carved bones, and notes that spoke not to a pet, but to a savior, a spirit, a mystery wrapped in fur and silence. The town of Windale, once known for nothing more than its sleepy fields and fog-draped hills, became a quiet symbol of the unexplainable, a place where something holy had passed through. Eli, now 13, grew into a young boy with a deep sense of purpose he couldn't always articulate. He began carrying a small journal of his own, just like Clara's, writing in it every day under the twisted branches of the cemetery tree where Shadow's spirit was said to linger. At night, when the stars poured down like silver rain, he'd sit cross-legged beside the grave and talk out loud to no one, or maybe to someone, because sometimes the wind seemed to stop to listen. He'd ask questions. Where do dogs go when they die? Did Clara find you again? Why did you come back for us? And sometimes he swore he heard soft paw steps behind him in the dirt, though no dog ever appeared. One rainy afternoon, nearly a year after Shadow passed, a storm knocked over a large oak near the edge of the woods where Clara had died. The tree fell across an old path no one had used in decades, exposing a hollow in the hillside, and beneath it, partially buried under the collapse, a rusted trunk bound in iron. The discovery would once again change everything. Inside the trunk were letters, pages yellowed and torn, with looping handwriting that bore the initials E.D. Alina Dinsmore. Town records confirmed she had once lived in Windale in the early 1900s before being institutionalized for visions and dangerous wandering tendencies. The letters described her dreams vividly. A dark dog with eyes like night who warned her of dangers, led her to strange places, and told her of others to come, children who would carry the gift of hearing him. Clara's last diary entries matched these dreams in uncanny ways. And when the Historical Society pieced together the story, it was Eli who made the connection no one else saw. Clara Dinsmore. Alina Dinsmore. Same bloodline, one removed by 5 generations, and he was next. That night, for the first time in years, Eli dreamed of Shadow not as a dog, but as a shape made of stars, a constellation that stepped from the sky and nuzzled against his chest, whispering without words. Others will come, the dream said. Some will be lost. Some will be found. You must listen. You must guide. When Eli awoke, he ran to his mother in tears. Clara's not done, he said. Shadow's not done. I have to help. It was the beginning of something bigger than any one person. Eli started a journal online, the Windale Chronicles, sharing not just Shadow's story, but others that began to reach him from people around the world. Stories of dogs who appeared in moments of crisis, of wolves who protected lost hikers, of puppies who refused to leave hospital beds. People sent photos, letters, accounts too vivid and emotional to ignore, and Eli realized what Shadow had started was not just about Clara, or Alina, or even Windale. It was about the universal thread of canine devotion that ran like a hidden river beneath humanity's surface. By the time Eli turned 16, a foundation had been formed. The Shadow Trust, a nonprofit for search and rescue dogs, therapy animals, and emotionally bonded strays. The headquarters, Windle, the very cemetery hill where it had all begun. But what no one knew, not even his parents, was that Eli had started hearing things, not voices exactly, but pulls, sensations, dreams that guided him to places where animals waited. One led him to a battered dog, outside an abandoned motel on Route 9. Another to a malnourished pup trapped in a drain pipe near the train station. Every time, Eli followed the instinct, and every time he found a dog in need, people began to call him the boy who listens. And maybe he did, but something darker also stirred. One fall evening, when the leaves turned like embers on the trees, and the wind howled too long for comfort, Eli wandered deeper into the woods than ever before, led by a sense of urgency he couldn't shake. There, in a clearing untouched by man for decades, he found a stone ring, ancient, moss-covered, radiating silence, and at its center, the bones of a dog. Shadow. No, too small. But buried with it was a collar with a tag engraved simply with Watcher. Eli knew then that Shadow had not been the first, that this had been going on longer than anyone knew, that these dogs, these watchers, were guardians passed between generations, between time, called to those who could hear, those in pain, those in peril. Clara had heard. So had a leaner. Now it was Eli. The watcher bond was not magic, not in the fairy tale sense, but something older, something written into the DNA of grief and hope. A few days later, Eli received a letter from a girl named Mina in a town 3 states away. Her brother had drowned, her family shattered, and yet a stray dog had shown up at her window every night since, just sitting, watching her cry. She didn't know why. She found Eli's site online and wrote, "Do you think this is Shadow or someone like him?" Eli didn't answer with certainty. He simply wrote, "Let him stay. Listen." The story repeated, town after town, dogs with no name or origin showing up beside hospital beds, car crash sites, graveyards, whispering comfort through presence. Shadow had been a beginning. Eli, now a young man, stood often beside Clara's grave, now marked with a bronze sculpture of her, and Shadow her hand resting on his head, both of them smiling. Tourists still came, reporters still called. But Eli didn't care for fame. He cared for the pattern, the thread, the pulse, until one winter, something new happened. Eli vanished. His truck was found at the edge of the forest, keys still in the ignition, headlights pointed toward the woods. His journal left open on the seat read, "She called me again." A massive search was launched. Days passed, then weeks, and then, quietly, people began reporting a boy seen walking trails across the country, sometimes with a dog, sometimes with many, always helping, always silent. Some say he became a myth, like Shadow. Others say he walks still, listening to the world through the ears of those who sit in silence, who grieve in solitude, and sometimes, on foggy nights in Windhill, a dog can be heard howling on the cemetery hill, joined by the echo of a boy's voice, calling softly through the dark. I hear you. I'm here. Years had passed since Eli walked into the woods that final time, and Windhill had changed. Modern buildings stood beside ancient ones. The cemetery had been expanded, and the bronze statue of Clara and Shadow now stood at the town's entrance, a welcoming monument to devotion and mystery that tourists touched as they entered, many whispering their wishes or prayers under their breath. But those who had known the original tale, the true followers of the Windhill Chronicles, believed that the story had not ended, only entered a quiet chapter, where time no longer flowed linearly, but circled like the smoke of an old candle, curling at the edges of memory. Shadow, though aged and visibly slower, never left the cemetery grounds unless drawn by something he could not resist. Once to chase off a teenager attempting to vandalize Clara's grave. Another time to follow a grieving boy all the way to the woods and back, protecting him from a sudden flash flood that no one else could have predicted. People began to believe Shadow could sense sorrow or loss, or perhaps unfinished love. And some even claimed that when they visited Clara's grave at twilight, they heard the soft pad of paws and felt a warmth settle beside them, like a silent promise of protection. What was stranger still was the fact that children often spotted a girl in white sitting, cross-legged beside Shadow at dusk, stroking his fur. Clara, they'd say with eerie confidence, before she vanished when adults came near. A few scoffed and labeled it childhood fantasy. But enough stories accumulated from unrelated sources that even the skeptical began to wonder if the veil between worlds had somehow thinned at Clara's resting place. Meanwhile, Eli's story traveled far and wide, adapted into documentaries, podcasts, even a best-selling book titled The Dog Who Refused to Mourn Alone. But none of those retellings ever truly captured the raw truth of what had happened in Windhill. How one dog had defied grief, time, and nature itself to remain loyal to a girl who once gave him a name and a home. The townsfolk kept fresh flowers on Clara's grave, and schoolchildren made drawings of her and Shadow for their yearly remembrance project, placing them in laminated sleeves to preserve against weather. It was during one such event that an elderly woman, unknown to many, stepped forward and placed a small, aged music box on the grave. She wore a green coat patched at the elbows and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed her face. But when the music box played, an unmistakable melody filled the cemetery, a lullaby Clara had composed and once sung to Shadow on sleepless nights. The moment the tune played, the wind changed direction, and Shadow, who had been dozing by the oak, rose slowly, walked to the grave, and lay down beside the music box, eyes fixed on the woman. She asked me to give this to you, the woman whispered, more to the air than anyone else, and then turned to leave, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. No one stopped her. Days later, The woman was nowhere to be found, and neither was the music box. But people who visited the cemetery after sundown swore they could hear faint lullabies on the breeze, even when the wind was still. Shadow's health declined with time, as expected, but even the local vet remarked that his heart, though old, showed no signs of slowing until one morning, quiet and golden with spring, when he simply didn't rise. He was found curled up beside Clara's grave, his head resting against the corner of the stone like he had so many times before. His eyes were closed, and there was no sign of pain, only peace. He was buried beside her, wrapped in a soft white cloth embroidered with his name, and his collar, worn thin but cherished, was hung on the cemetery gate, encased in glass. That night, the town held a candle-lit vigil, not in mourning, but in celebration of a bond so unshakable it outlasted life. Speeches were made, stories were shared, and children sang Clara's lullaby. The mayor officially renamed the cemetery path as Shadow's Walk, and a local artist painted a mural near the town square depicting Clara and Shadow walking together through a forest that shimmered like a dream. Years passed again, and Wendell grew, but the legend remained rooted deep in its soil. New dogs came and went, but none ever touched hearts the way Shadow had. And then one day, on a quiet morning, nearly a decade after Shadow's passing, a young girl barefoot, with dark curls and eyes that shimmered like dew, walked into town, her hand holding a leash, though no dog was at the end of it. She wore a red scarf that seemed far too old for her age, and bore a letter with the return address smudged and unreadable. "I'm looking for Clara," she told the librarian, her voice clear but distant, as though echoing across time. The librarian, startled, led her outside where the statue stood, and the girl smiled, nodded, and said, "That's her." When asked how she knew, the girl simply replied, "She sings to me at night." She disappeared by evening, no trace found in any hotel or guest book, and for weeks afterward, the music box melody could be heard playing from the cemetery without source or explanation. Eventually, Wendell accepted that some stories never truly end. They only wait for the next listener to hear them. And so, the town continued on, wrapped in a tale that refused to be forgotten. And every evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, a soft wind would drift through the cemetery, stirring petals and stories, brushing past the statue of a girl and her dog, together forever.